This is Inside M&A with Dave Cantin.
Good morning, everyone. Jim Fitzpatrick. Thanks so much for joining me on another edition of Inside M&A. The automotive industry is navigating a complex landscape, from economic headwinds to fluctuating stock prices to the ongoing impact of tariffs. On today's segment of Inside M&A, we're talking about the retail automotive industry today with my co-host Brian Gordon, president of the Dave Cantin Group, and our guest Andrew Gier, who is the research analyst at Capstone. Andrew joined Capstone in 2015 and is an analyst on the energy and industrials team. He advises clients on policy issues surrounding U.S. trade and industrial policy. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Jim, thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Sure. Brian, let me start with you. Maybe you can give us a little bit of an overview from your perspective. You've got your hand really on the pulse of what's happening in retail automotive. You guys at the Dave Cantin Group work with hundreds, if not thousands, of dealers all over the country, all over North America for that matter. From your perspective today as we sit here, how are things out there?
Look, things are better than you would think from the news headlines out there, and I think that just shows the resiliency that we always talk about with dealers. They're always ready for the next challenge, and they are always figuring out ways to overcome it. But tariffs is still the dominant topic that everybody wants not only to talk about, but they're trying to find sources of information that can give them clues to where this whole thing is headed. And that's why we just had to bring Andrew on. We had the opportunity to sit down with Andrew about 2 weeks ago or so, and I found his talk, his presentation, probably the most insightful that I'd seen and the most forward-looking, which is what I'm most excited about.
Sure. Well, welcome in, Andrew. You are on the hot seat today, as they say. So we want to kind of get from you what your perspective is. Obviously, there's a lot going on out there, and there's a lot of dealers that have concerns. There's a lot of OEMs that have got concerns about things that are happening. So before we jump in today, give us an overview as to the way things look from your perspective.
Yeah, happy to. So, I guess if we're talking about the Trump administration's trade policy as a whole, I think what you've seen over the first 100 days is something that is far more expansive than what we saw for the entirety of the last 4 years that Trump was in office. If you're just taking a quick look at sort of what he did during his first term, it was relatively small and I would say more targeted in a lot of ways. So he started off with withdrawing from TPP. He then went into some product-specific investigations, things like steel and aluminum, some other sort of industry-brought cases on solar and washing machines. And then it was a couple of years before he really started getting after China with a Section 301 investigation. They started with 25% tariffs on what, compared to what we've seen so far, was a very small basket of what we import from China. And then you saw them expanded over time, but it really was a story of just going after China and then going after a small basket of products. I think when you compare that to what we've seen already, and like you think about it from an auto industry perspective, it's instantly much bigger. For anyone that's been following this for a few years now, you might be aware that there was actually an auto Section 232 investigation during President Trump's first term. That ultimately didn't end up turning into anything, but it came back in a pretty big way at the start of this administration.
Yeah.
Again, from an auto's perspective, it's also worth noting that, arguably two of the first targets in President Trump's trade war were Canada and Mexico, two countries that are absolutely pivotal from an auto supply chain standpoint.
Right.
On top of that, you've seen him go after China in a big way. You've also seen him impose these blanket reciprocal tariffs, starting up at really significant tariff rates, going up all the way to 50% potentially. But then, currently all those rates are sitting at about 10%. And then that's in addition to, I think we've got 7 Section 232 investigations that are outstanding, in addition to the 3 that have already imposed tariffs.
Sure.
Andrew, give us quickly a little bit of an overview on where you get your information. Where are you sourcing? And we'll talk a little bit more in a few minutes about what you think is going to happen from here. But where do you get your information?
Yeah. So it's not just us interpreting President Trump's Truth Social posts or just, reading Political or anything like that. Really, our process is very heavily rooted in outreach and talking to stakeholders that are engaging in these issues from all different perspectives. So, we'll talk to people that are working in government, whether it's the Department of Commerce or USTR or somewhere else within the executive branch. We'll talk to trade groups that are worried about the impact of tariffs on their specific industry. I find that the most helpful conversations I have tend to be with former government folks. So, we're lucky in that we had 4 years of Trump a few years ago, and a lot of those people are now no longer working in government. They moved on to other things. But I think the benefit of talking to people like that is that they're in a position where they can be a lot more candid and a lot more forward looking about where things will go. They're able to opine in a way that just in any administration, a government employee can't really do. And I think, one thing I would note too that we've seen, at least in the early days of this administration, as we've been waiting for some of the political appointees in these trade roles to be seated, is that there's a real, not only are they really busy and like working on a million different things, but there's also a real fear of leaking or sort of getting ahead on messaging. They're sort of limited in terms of what they can share. And so it's really helpful to talk to that person that's been in the seat where they're the one giving President Trump a proposal to impose tariffs. They understand how he's thinking about it, because in a lot of ways you are kind of solving for one guy on this stuff. And so to have people that have had those conversations, I think those ultimately end up being the most helpful for what we're doing.
Yeah. Now in the automotive industry, I think in terms of reasons for Trump's tariff policy, probably onshoring is the one that we're hearing the most about from an automotive industry perspective, bringing jobs back to America, bringing manufacturing to America. What are, from your perspective, the primary reasons why Trump is doing this whole thing at all?
Yeah. So I think it really comes down to three things, and honestly, onshoring is one of the things I would have said with it. I think maybe where I would start though, and it's directly related to the onshoring point, but I think the important thing to know here is that in a lot of ways, the trade deficit in goods, and I'm bringing up that metric in particular, so like we're taking out services, which are a big part of U.S. trade, but specifically the trade deficit in goods is kind of the North Star for this administration and how they think about trade. That is sort of how they view success and how they identify problems. And so to the extent that there is a major trade deficit in a specific product or with a specific country especially, that's going to be something where they see there's being bigger problems potentially. President Trump has been very consistent on this messaging, throughout his time as president, but honestly, even going back to his career in business, he has always viewed the trade deficit as being something that's akin to theft in a lot of ways. I think beyond that, there's a lot of people within the president's trade circle that view the loss of U.S. manufacturing as a national security risk. Like they're thinking about this hypothetical conflict with China, what's going to be most successful in winning that war. And I think there's a real concern that quantity is sort of a quality of its own and something that's really important to warfighting in the 21st century. And so they're worried about this erosion of the U.S. industrial base. And so it's important to sort of address the trade deficit.
And is that sort of a go back to World War II and think that if you have a manufacturing base, you could convert it to whatever you might need to manufacture in a time of war?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a big part of it. I think honestly, though, some of it's informed by the war in Ukraine too, because where you've seen a certain amount of that happening and just being able to, like, how quickly can you get off the ground and doing it? But I think that's a big part of it. So like I mentioned, like as you said, like the onshoring is a huge part of it, and like I think that's really important too. When we're talking about China specifically, and one thing I would say is like when you're thinking about an industry like autos, a lot of these, like it might seem like they're lashing out at the whole world or going after every country, but a lot of this is really animated by China in particular. And what I would say is their goal with China is strategic decoupling. They don't want to be dependent on China for certain industries. I would say the auto industry is one of them. And then, I would say that the other part of it too is that, they feel like at a certain level, U.S. manufacturers are kind of at a structural disadvantage because of the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency. And so some of this is about offsetting that. The last thing I would say though too is, and like I think you need to kind of put the tariffs in different buckets. So you've got like the Section 232 tariffs on autos, which I think are very much about that onshoring and strategic decoupling and stuff like that. But the other bucket of it, I would put like in these universal tariffs, the 10% tariffs. Those in my mind, like, so some of it is about sort of offsetting that structural imbalance, but a big part of it is just about generating revenue. And you hear President Trump talk about this all the time, this external revenue service. That's a lot of what they're trying to get at here. Like a big portion of it is trying to pay for the president's legislative agenda. It's about trying to lower the deficit. And they really do believe within this administration in a lot of ways that it's a way of sort of outsourcing the US tax bill to foreign countries and foreign companies.
Now, are there any reasons that might make less policy sense? But if you're Donald Trump, does this feel pretty good that the whole world has to negotiate with you too?
Yeah. I mean, like, look, I think it's a space that he is really comfortable in, and it's something that he really enjoys. Like, I I think there's like an element of strategic chaos here that he really enjoys, and I think he thinks plays to his advantage, and that no
Yeah.
one can predict what he's going to do. And like you see it in a lot of these, like Canada, Mexico said it, China have said it, like they never really articulate what they want. It's just all about seeing what people are going to bring. Um, one phrase that I've heard from people that like have been working in this White House that they use a lot of times is tribute when they're talking about this stuff. And so the idea is like they use that phrase because the idea is that in order to have the privilege of access to the U.S. market, you need to come and you need to offer tribute to this administration. And so, what does that look like? It's different in every case. It might be lowering tariff rates. It might be investments. Um, you know, maybe it's I don't think the plane's directly related to it, but that could be like another example here. But that's I think really like something that he really enjoys is being able to be in the middle of making these deals. It's something that was a big part of his career before he went into politics, and I think it's just an environment that he's really comfortable in. It also gives him a lot of opportunities to declare wins. He can, even though like if we talk about like the UK deal, for instance, from a couple of weeks ago, even though in a lot of ways that was an agreement to talk more, he can still come in and claim victory on things, and I think he likes that element of it too.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned the UK trade deal. We got together the beginning of that week, and I was impressed during the first conversation we had. But a week later, I was even more impressed because you said the first domino that was going to fall would be the UK, and I think it was like 3 days later that announcement was made. And then you said you think that there's going to be essentially a pullback on the you know the heat with which China and the US were sort of talking. And sure enough, that weekend we had that conversation and that news come out that they had the meeting and everything went well and we're going to do a 90-day pause and and everything was going to work out. Um, Talk a little bit about what you see happening from here. And let's focus on some of the markets that are just so critical to the automotive industry. Mexico and Canada, you obviously mentioned. China is interesting, and I would love your perspective on whether tariffs and the negotiation of a major trade deal could potentially grease the wheels to bring Chinese vehicles into the US, or whether you think that a barrier will still exist. That's a big topic of conversation year in and year out in the auto industry. And then, of course, the EU and several of the countries like Germany that are part of the EU.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I'm gonna need you to keep me on track there for a few of those because I can dive into each one of those I think for like
Yep.
an hour probably. But so I guess maybe starting off with like maybe the very near term, like where do we see deals happening? And like I think it's worth bringing up these deals because as we saw with the UK agreement, like one part of it was they were addressing autos trade, and that you had this quota of 100,000 vehicles coming in from the UK. They were able to come in at a 10% rate instead of a 25% rate. And so I guess like the first thing I would say with this is like just sort of absent of talking about countries, like what do these deals look like? I think this is informative in a lot of ways. And I'll say, Brian, I appreciate you giving me credit for saying that the UK was first to get a deal. I will tell you that among trade people, that wasn't a particularly controversial stance, and the reason for it is that like as we're thinking about where there's problems, like what's the low hanging fruit for a deal, the UK was the obvious choice. It's a country the US has a good surplus in, so there's not a problem. It's a country President Trump likes. It's a country that he's wanted to get closer to. And so it made sense that they would be one of the first countries to engage here. With that in mind, like if you take the premise that the UK was one of the best positioned here, then in the fact that they weren't able to fully escape these Section 232 tariffs, I think that tells you a lot about what, like when you're thinking about it from like a European perspective, you're thinking about these like European automakers. the EU, I know, would love to get out of these Section 232 agreements. They said they don't want a partial deal like the UK got. I'm pretty skeptical about their ability to get something like that, honestly. Um, I think just quickly, maybe to touch on the countries that I'm watching in the near term, there was a rumor last week that when President Trump got back from his trip to the Middle East, that he would be signing another one of these deals. And that obviously didn't come to pass, but I do think there's a good chance they announce something, in the relatively near term. In terms of the countries that I'm watching most closely, Australia is one of those countries that I would put in that bucket of low hanging fruit. There's not a lot of issues there for them to address. Trump likes Australia. There's a lot of U.S. East Asian trading partners that I would watch. South Korea is kind of in an interesting place with their transitional government in terms of their ability to negotiate, but they historically have been very fast. Japan has been very active in talking to this administration. Autos are a huge part of that conversation, obviously, too. And so they've kind of felt a little bit aggrieved, I would say, because they felt like they had a deal to avoid autos tariffs during Trump's first term, and then he came back and did this. India is one that I would say that's maybe not obvious to a lot of people. It's not as relevant for the autos side, but we're hearing a lot of positive things about where India is on this. And then you also hear smaller countries like Israel and New Zealand even being tossed in with that mix. The one thing I would say is that the sense I'm getting is that a lot of the focus right now is on countries in Asia, and it's on sort of isolating China by going after a lot of their trading partners in Asia, building a ring around them, and that's where they're most focused. I'm sure there's a lot of people in the auto industry that would love to hear something on Canada and Mexico soon. I think that's going to be a longer process, unfortunately, but I'm still pretty optimistic on that. But maybe I'll pause there. I'm happy to dive into the countries a little bit more.
Well, I think even before the countries, one of the things you talked about, which is important, and maybe at the outset of this, people thought that this was all a big negotiating tactic and it would yield some benefits to the United States, but we wouldn't be left with a ton of tariffs all over the place. And it sounds like your perspective and Capstone's perspective is that tariffs are here to stay and maybe here to stay for a long time based on just how administrations tend to handle, the work of tariffs in administrations prior.
I absolutely agree with that. I think the nice thing about this is we just had 4 years precedent with the Democratic administration coming in. What I've been telling clients pretty consistently since the election is that we think a lot of this tariff policy is actually going to be structural. In terms of areas where I have the highest conviction on it, I start off with China, and that there are going to be really significant tariffs on a basket of products that they deem to be strategic. And the goal of this administration with these tariffs, to be clear, when we're talking about this in the China context in a lot of cases, is it's strategic decoupling. The goal is that those products aren't coming in. So they're going to be high. 60% is what Trump promised during the campaign. It can get kind of confusing with all the different layers of tariffs that we've seen come into play this year, but that's not a bad bellwether for what you could expect here. The Section 232 tariffs, I've mentioned that before. I would expect that they are going to move forward with tariffs in most of those investigations. What I think you will see is that over time, they're going to find that so Section 232 itself is a really blunt instrument, and it just sort of lends itself to imposing a tariff on all products within a specific category coming in from all countries. And anyone that's been in a trade exposed business knows that can cause a lot of problems, especially when you only have one source available and you're not able to sort of mitigate it, and you're dealing with a low margin environment. And so I think that's naturally going to have to be clawed back a little bit. You'll see it clawed back on a country by country basis, on a company by company basis. As I mentioned, we saw a little bit of that happening with the UK. I would expect more of that to happen. The other thing I would say is when you're thinking about those 232s, what are they going to look like? I think you're going to see a lot of tariff rate quotas. And so that's kind of similar to what we saw with the UK, where they'll say, okay, a certain number of exports, and it'll be tied to historical volumes, which is what was the case with the UK, can come in at either a lower tariff rate or tariff free. And then anything above that rate is coming in at the full 25% or whatever the tariff rate is.
In a market like the EU, how does that work when you have a variety of different countries all producing their own goods that are all vying for space within that quota. And in automotive in particular, you've got Germany, which is obviously the biggest player. How does all that work with negotiating with the EU, but then you have a single country that is so prevalent in a particular industry?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a really interesting question, Brian, and I don't know that there's a clear answer at this point. From a trade perspective, the way the EU is supposed to function is that they negotiate as a bloc, and so you just have one group that is negotiating on behalf of all 27 member states, and then in theory, you would have one quota set around the entire EU for that. Now, there's a lot of ways you can design it. You could potentially design it in a way that it goes down to the individual member states. You can potentially set an EU-wide quota, and then you leave it up to the EU to determine how that quota is allocated. Um, in some cases, this will work on just sort of like a first come, first serve type of basis, where the first people to export, they get the quota, and then after that, you're paying the tariffs. In some cases, it's more of like if a country wants to handle it, where they're saying, okay, we're gonna have some kind of like auction process or something like that to determine who's getting it fairly. There's a lot of different options for how you can do it, but the thing I would say with the EU is in general is in like there to be clear, there have been quite a few positive news stories over the last weeks about the Europeans really wanting to engage with this administration on trade. I will say that I am still really skeptical on that. There's a few reasons for it. One is the thing I already mentioned, that you have to get 27 different constituencies to all agree on something, which is really hard. The other side of it is just the posture of this administration towards Europe in general. We saw it in the signal leaks from a few weeks ago. The one thing that was making senior members of this administration hesitant to pull the trigger on those bombs was they thought it could possibly help Europe. And so, I think there's a huge amount of, I don't know that hostility is the right word, but, they're not viewing Europe as a friend in this context. And so I think they're really ready to potentially escalate this, especially after that July 9th time period.
And so, sort of recapping what you said, and keep me honest here, it sounds like from an auto industry perspective, countries that are in the best positions to negotiate a deal right now, South Korea and Japan, Canada and Mexico are going to take some time. And the EU is probably lagging behind all of those in terms of just the administration's perspective on wanting to do a deal and the complexity of the deal that has to get done.
Yeah, I think that's right. And like what I would add to it maybe is I think I could very easily see the terms that are agreed to with Canada and Mexico being ultimately more favorable than what like South Korea and Japan ultimately get on these autos Section 232 tariffs. And it's something I'm sure you guys and your audience are very familiar with, but the integrated nature of the auto supply chains in North America is something that's hard to avoid in this conversation.
Yeah.
A lot of the US automakers are raising concerns about if you impose these tariffs on Canada and Mexico, it's going to make them less competitive globally and even domestically if they're dealing with that. And so I think like if we think about what the U.S., Canada, and Mexico agreement looks like, it's a little bit different, in that this agreement is going to take place in the context of the broader USMCA review that is kicking off in earnest now that you have a new government in Canada. And so what they're going to really focus on with that are what are called rules of origin within USMCA, and what those basically say is what percentage of North American content do you have to have in order for your car to travel across borders tariff-free. And so what this administration is ultimately going to be looking for there is a little bit more complex than what they're looking for with South Korea and Japan. But what they're going to try to do is they're going to rewrite those rules in a way that carves out a bigger portion of the pie for the United States, but then also makes them a little bit more sophisticated, I think, with an eye towards keeping out Chinese automakers in particular. You mentioned it earlier, this idea that like what's the risk that you're going to like see the door opening for Chinese autos to start coming into the US? It's something that I know this administration and the previous administration were really focused on, the idea that Mexico could be sort of a Trojan horse for the Chinese auto industry coming in. That's something they're really worried about. They're worried about like these Chinese automakers setting up shop in Mexico, using a lot of Chinese components and selling into the US, and then ultimately damaging the US auto industry. I think they're going to be spending a lot of time looking not only at like subcomponents and where they're coming from, but also even investment in countries like Mexico and making sure they're screening investment to sort of keep the Chinese automakers out.
Mm-hmm.
And so the protectionism is part of it. Have you heard that there's specific a specific agenda to try to protect the U.S. domestic manufacturers. Is that part of it, or is it just such a small part, and the rest of it is about protecting kind of the broader U.S. economy and consumers and onshoring and all of that? How much just trying to make sure that our industry is protected play into this whole thing?
I think autos are one of those rare industries that they actually get a little bit of priority, and they sort of they occupy a special place within this administration's mind, I think, in a lot of ways. And I think you see that in the fact that they went through the effort to go through the specific Section 232 process on autos. I mean, you can go back, like if you're looking at things that President Trump's talking about, like you can go back to interviews he was doing in like the 80s where he was talking about like why are there so many Japanese cars on American roads? Like he's always been interested in the trade deficit and the dependence on imports in the auto industry in particular. And so I do think they are really mindful of what's happening with the auto industry. Now, I wouldn't take that to mean that there won't be policy changes that are, that adversely impact the auto industry. Like the classic example of it was, well, they also imposed all these steel and aluminum tariffs, which make the cost of inputs for the auto industry more expensive. And so there's going to be an element of that. But they are, I think, very focused on trying to support the auto industry. Some of that gets to like where some of the key swing states for the president in the industrial Midwest and supporting those kinds of jobs and supporting key constituencies that have supported the president in the past. But I do think there is a special interest in the auto industry that you can't say exists for a lot of other industries.
Well, that's good to hear sitting in our seats. I'll tell you that. Any big surprises you think, or you're hearing mumblings of that people might not be talking about in kind of mainstream media right now?
Um, Man, I don't know where to go with that because there's so many I could go with. Like one thing I would say is the sense that I get is that a lot of people are kind of assuming that we're on this steady path now where tariffs only go down from here. And I would say that is absolutely not the case in my mind. And you need to expect that there are still going to be some bumps in the road. Over the next few weeks, one of the things we're watching for, obviously, are these reciprocal trade agreements and what kinds of deals are people able to strike with the United States. Is a reminder for everyone, sort of until July 9th, everyone's at this 10% rate. And then after that, if you don't have a deal, hypothetically, you could go back up to this higher reciprocal rate, which, like if we take like a major U.S. trading partner like Vietnam, for instance, their rate's 46%. So that's really material for a lot of industries.
So that was the April pause that brought everything back to 10% in order to
Yeah,
try to get negotiated deals done.
exactly. And so what I would say is like talk about Southeast Asia, for instance. One thing I'm hearing is that the terms of that agreement, it might not be that they get to stay at 10%. It might be that they're at 25 to 30%. And so, you could see those tariffs come back in a pretty significant way. But yeah, maybe I'll pause there. So that's a big one.
Well, and so that's a date that everybody has to keep an eye on. And I guess just shed a little bit of light on some of the recent news of what are we going to send 150 letters to countries who essentially have to respond with what they're willing to do. What is the reality of trying to get that many deals done with all of these countries in the next, call it 2 months?
Man, I'll say I do not envy anyone sitting at USTR right now with that. Like for reference for people, like USTR, so USTR is the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. Historically, they are the lead agency on any kind of like free trade agreement negotiation. It's not a big agency. It's got like 200 some people that work there. And so you're in a situation where you almost have like one person per trading partner on this stuff. The other data point I'll give you is that like ordinarily when you're going into a trade agreement, it takes a country like 6 months just to figure out what they want in that trade agreement. And so what you're talking about is roughly half that time reaching a deal. And I think that tells you a lot about what the art of the possible is here. And you kind of combine that with what we saw on the UK side, and that you can go through the text, and like it was very sparse text that was released by both sides, where like, and you read it closely, what it says in a lot of cases is that they're going to agree to talk more about opening up the UK market for US agriculture exports, for instance. And the reason is it's just you can't reach a really detailed understanding and agreement there without just having a little bit more time. And so I think what a lot of these are going to look like is it's going to be agreements in principle. It'll be the idea that, okay, we have some kind of middle ground where we think we can meet. We need some more time to negotiate. I think there's going to be, so there'll be some kinds of deals like that where they call them a deal, but they're not. It's more like a deal to talk more. There's going to be a sort of a tier down below that where I think it's going to be, okay, we've had some good talks. We're going to maybe kick out this date a little bit, kick the can down the road. And then I think there's going to be a few cases where they're going to want to make an example of someone, and they're going to increase the tariffs and say, hey, you haven't made enough progress. Like, thinking about auto supply chain specifically, I'd worry about the EU in that context, honestly. Like, I think there's a lot of reasons why that could be the case.
Yeah. I mean, incredibly insightful stuff. And obviously this is something that is changing, by the day, by the hour even. And so we'd love to keep talking and keep getting your insights and have you back again soon.
Well, look forward to it. Would happily come back.
Yep. Brian Gordon, president of the Dave Cantin Group, and Andrew Gier, research analyst for Capstone. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for joining me on the show today. I very much appreciate it. And as I agree with Brian, Andrew, we'd love to have you back on the show because there's so much more that we could be asking you, but time won't allow. So thanks so much for all the time today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks.
Thanks for watching Inside M&A with Dave Cantin, conversations for the industry, exclusively on the CBT Automotive Network. The Dave Cantin Group is the nation's leading advisory company in the automotive industry. To contact a mergers and acquisitions advisor from the Dave Cantin Group, visit davecantingroup.com.